Now naturally the only appropriate wood for a Death Star build is alder, and cue the totally dramatic and unnecessary lumber stacking sequence. Turn on Boba Jet, who will be taking care of dust collection today. First step, like any other project, is a rough breakdown at the tie miter. Next, over to my good friend Jabba the Hutt to start flattening the faces. Okay, my planer still does not have a name. I have tried and come up with nothing. Now, if you're watching this and you've got something that's good and punny, please leave it in the comments below, and if I pick your name, I'll send you a swag bag or something. But remember, gotta be punny. Back over to Jabba to square up an edge on each piece, and do the weird woodworking thing where you rub the edges after cutting for some reason. If you haven't seen my shop tour video with the boom arm, how dare you? But you're going to be seeing a lot of this today. Over to the tool that started it all, Darth Blader, to cut everything down to final width. Nothing fancy here, just trying to keep these as wide as possible. Alright, now that we've got everything ripped down to size, I'm just laying these out on the table to make sure I like the orientation. I don't subscribe to the idea that you need to alternate the growth rings on the end grain. I just think that's utter nonsense. So I purely base this off of aesthetics. I am using this fancy template that I made out of Amazon boxes to make sure I avoid any knots or weird figure in the wood. Now a quick carpenter's triangle, and then I'm going to number each board in order so it's easy to get these back in the right orientation when the time comes. Now you could stop here and go right into the glue up, but I like to take it one step further using the in and the out method. So what you see here is I'm labeling the corresponding edges with an I and then an O. Back over at Jabba, any of the edges with an I are going to face in towards your jointer fence when you take one last pass, and then any edge with an O is going to face out away from the fence. And the idea here is that any of the error you have in your fence alignment is going to cancel itself out when those corresponding edges eventually meet. And I found since I started doing this little trick that the results are crispy glue ups. Grab a bottle of my favorite Grow Glue, Type Bond 3, and let's make a panel. Now I did shoot dominoes in off camera, not at all necessary. You could use biscuits or dowels or nothing at all, but I find it helps keep everything nice and level with these thinner boards. I'm also doing this glue up in two sections, splitting the top in half, gluing those together separately, and then doing one final glue up. I've just found it's a lot easier with these wider panels and saves me a significant amount of stress during the glue up. So if you can afford the time and you're doing this purely as a hobby or to create lovely content for the fine folks on YouTube, I would highly suggest that. I let these dry overnight, and I will see you tomorrow.
That's no moon.
Alright, let's make a circle. Going over to where I keep my Jar Jar bits and grabbing a 1/4 inch spiral upcut bit. And there's the boom arm again. If you've ever done circle cutting, you know how annoying cord management can be as you're starting to go around and around in circles. So having something like this to secure the cords overhead is an absolute lifesaver. I'll be making 3 passes with the circle cutting jig, taking about a 1/4 inch each time. Now the trick to avoid a lot of sanding later on is to make sure you find the right speed here. If you go too slow, you end up burning the edges, but if you go too fast, your cut's going to be really rough. So make sure you're listening to the router for feedback. Also, very important to make sure you're petting your wood after each cut. Don't forget that. I took 2 more passes, and just like that, we've got ourselves a circle. I'm going old school for the hole within my newly cut circle and using a jigsaw. I drilled a pilot hole to get the cut started, and then I just slowly work my way around, making sure that I don't cut up right against the line. Over to the Sandalorian, grid is the way, and I'm just easing right up to that trace circle that I drew earlier. After what felt like an eternity, we're done. I decided to flex my crazy woodworking skills and use dados to attach the shelves to the panel. So after laying out my lines, I'm just using a straight edge as a guide. I'm going to cut each dado in 2 passes with a straight cutting bit. And make sure you're going left to right along the fence here and not climb cutting. With the dados done, it was time to cut up my fancy circle. I randomly traced out a pattern and then got the jigsaw back out, which I happen to use more on this project than I've used it in total in the last 5 years. And after a solid 30 minutes of cutting and petting the wood, I was done. Moving on to the shelves, I think you know the drill here. Cut, joint, plane, test fit, and rip to length. For the shelves that extend out to the edge of the circle, I want those edges to match the radius, so I transferred that line onto the shelves, then took those pieces over to C-3PO and slowly snuck up on my pencil marks. To hide my bougie stop dados, I simply notched out the ends of the shelves. To do that, I scribed the depth of the dado with a pencil onto the shelves, then go back over to C-3PO to make the cut. Now you could be fancy and use a chisel here, but it's a piece of shop furniture and C-3PO does just fine. After cutting all the shelves to size, I do a quick test fit. Now dados and glue would be plenty strong because these really aren't holding much weight, but I wanted to keep flexing my woodworking skills, so I went over and grabbed Han Solo to start making some corbels for the underside of the shelves. I cut out a bunch of little squares, then took those over to the Drillenium Falcon to put a hole in the center of my squares with a Forstner bit. Then I brought my squares with holes in them over to C-3PO and cut those right down the middle. And just like that, I've got fancy little corbels. The assembly of the shelves is pretty straightforward, just using glue and clamps to secure them in the dados. Then using a combination of wood glue and CA glue with some accelerator for the corbels. And it's almost like I planned it that my corbels double as some clamping squares. For finish, I decided to go with India ink. Now, this is a great option to ebonize softer woods that tend to get a little bit blotchy with traditional stains. Super easy to apply, just flood it on there and distribute evenly. You can use a cotton rag, I'm using a foam brush here. I let that dry overnight and then off camera the next day I sprayed on 3 coats of lacquer over the top. I'm hanging this with French cleats, but I wanted to give the illusion that the Death Star was floating away from the wall a little bit. So I grabbed Ryobi 1 Kenobi and tacked on a 1/2-inch spacer, and then secured the French cleat on top of the spacer. And what shop project doesn't need LED lights? I screwed the French cleat to the wall, and that is it, my friends. She is done and ready for the big reveal.